So we're going to speak in conversation, and I'm going to just jump right into it. I'm Sue Hutton, and I've worked in the front lines for many years, and now I'm on secondment over at Arch Disability Law Center, where I have the privilege of working with Peter Park, and we've co-founded an organization. So do you want to, Peter, why don't we jump right into it?
Why don't we jump into it? Okay.
And tell us a little bit about...
why did I think about respecting rights? A fellow that's the executive director was one day, he said, "Peter, we need to talk more about rights." And that was how we got started. And it snowballed from there. Way back when we first started, there were a bunch of us. But now there are only about 34. But that's okay. We're starting of any kind of movement. It starts with only a few, and then it snowballs from there.
And Peter's right. It was with Rob Latanzio, who is the executive director of Arch Disability Law Center. And Peter, Rob, and I were talking about challenges in developmental sector in People First, an organization Peter's going to talk about in a little bit, on how difficult it is to keep momentum around inclusion rights and around making sure that people labeled with intellectual disabilities are involved in every aspect of their lives in decision making. So
that's why the title here was "Nothing About Us Without Us." That was an old saying from People First, but I enlarged on it and said, "Nothing about us without us," and that includes research.
Here we are. So just a quick little nod to respecting rights. So we do what we call a triple scoop approach, in which there's a person labeled with an intellectual disability working alongside a lawyer and a social worker. So all three of us present our rights education. And we travel around the province doing workshops around capacity, consent, and decision-making rights. So you're more than welcome to contact us, and we'd love to come out to see you. So that's why we call it triple scoop. We use an image of ice cream, and we have a lawyer's face on one and a self-advocate's face on another.
Yeah.
And the other super quick nod, Arch Disability Law Center, for those of you who are not familiar with it, also province-wide support and access around legal rights issues for people with disabilities, all across disabilities. And that's where Peter and I work together.
And actually, I got started with Arch way back when. I've been on their board, been on their executive, you name it. So I'm quite familiar, even, well, back when I had my other life, as I call it, with People First, which I founded. People First is a self-advocacy organization of people who have been labeled as having an intellectual disability, doing things like not letting their social worker tell them what the hell where they should live and that sort of thing. That speaking out for themselves, speaking for telling their own story. Learning about their rights, exercising their rights. Many people, including myself, didn't know they have the right to. I had to ask, because I've got a disability, I had to ask a lawyer if I could get married. Scary. I asked that lawyer, and he said, "Peter, I know you too well. You would get married anyhow. You're like your brother." I said, "That's right. This lawyer happens to be my cousin, so."
And on that note, just to find out for who's in the room, how many of you work in the community? How many of you are out in sort of direct practices?
Direct funding.
So, quite a number of us. How many of you work largely in academic settings? Yep, and a lot of us too. Excellent. How many of you are familiar with People First? Most of us. Yep, fantastic. Great. Just to get a little bit of a sense of that. And how many of you are familiar with Peter's work and Peter's life? Good, so quite a few of
Very
us.
good.
But we're going to tell you a little bit more because it's super important to know people who have paved the way around inclusion rights. And Peter really is a pioneer. A lot of self-advocates call Peter the godfather of self-advocacy around inclusion. So we're going to do a little bit more. And I'm going to just ask you a few more questions, Peter. So as you heard, Peter founded People First of Ontario. I always say the day after you got out of the institution, but it was, within the year. So, but do you want to talk about your life in the institution? Because Peter, and I'll just add this tiny piece, Peter was involved in research the entire time that he was institutionalized. And
Didn't realize it.
And didn't realize it. So when you realized, wait a minute, this is research. They're doing it to me, on me, without my consent. Can you talk a little bit about that when you, you had epilepsy? And
now, I happen to have epilepsy. I was fortunate to have a father who was happened to be a pharmacist. And since he said, Peter, you need these books, Merck Manual and CPS. And
the Merck Manual and the CPS Compendium.
They tried to give me medication that you can't get at Shoppers Drug Mart or anywhere else in the institution. I knew I was being used as a human guinea pig. I wouldn't take it if it wasn't in these two books, the Merck Manual and CPS. Oh, well. Anyhow, I would end up in the ward where I was bare, the walls were bare, the floors were bare. There was a hole in the center of the floor, and if you had to go to the washroom, that's where you went to the washroom.
So when the staff in the institution brought you medication and said, okay, Peter, it's time for you to take these, you'd look at the pills and say, well, what are they?
What are they? Who made them?
And you'd pull out the old CPS compendium and you'd look them up.
I'd look it up, and if the one down there, I'll take this because it's down there. I know what it's going to do to me. But this, I don't know. So I wouldn't take it. I'll give it back to him.
That's right. And then when you said, sorry, I can't find this in the manual, this is not in here, and I don't know what the side effects are, so no, I'm not comfortable to take this. And you would be marched down to the segregation ward, which you call D ward, detention ward.
Detention, whatever you want to call it, where, as I said, you were bare, the walls were bare. Actually, I went there, my first visit there was when I did a stupid thing. They asked a counselor where I went. I was about to turn, at that time, 21 was the voting age, and I was about to turn 21. I asked, said, where do I go to vote? Who's the writing person? Blah blah blah. All the rest of it. Peter, you are an institution. You can't vote.
Right. So you simply wanted to learn about your basic rights as a citizen to vote and participate, and you were told no, you won't be voting. You're in the institution. So you were aware of how your rights were being stripped down.
Oh yeah.
The whole time you were in the institution.
Yes, definitely.
And this is part of what is so amazing about Peter is his work. So he did not stop once he got out of the institution. Did not stop moving around, and not only was he involved in direct conversations with self-advocates, but you're involved with researchers from very early on. And like I said, the whole time Peter was in the institution, we talked about this, and it's like, wait a minute, you've been involved in research your whole life against your consent, right? No consent. And then once you got out in the community, and you've worked with Marcia Rue, you've worked with Marianne Burke, you've spoken at conferences all around the world, around research. And I just want to do a little plug here. Peter and I will talk about it a bit later too. But if anybody here is interested in doing any work on collecting these rich, incredible stories, we realized, Peter and I had dinner with Vicki Clark, who was the
who I used to work with and known for 37 years. So, well, we sat down last night and figured out, when did we meet? How many years ago? 37. Ooh, it's scary. But we've been very good friends since then.
And she worked with you as the advisor for People First of Canada.
And she worked, yeah.
And she's also the litigation guardian for the class action lawsuits with Rideau.
Yeah.
As you were in Oxford Regional Centre.
Yeah.
But one of the things you and Vicki were talking about as we talked, for a few hours around the history, is how important it is, and that really somebody needs to come help collect all these stories and do some research around all this rich history, right?
Oh yeah, I've been thinking how we're going to be able to sit down in a room with people like myself, and then there are a couple of people out west, or 3 people out west, and a fellow from Nova Scotia, all in that same room. What a history! We could all get to all people that were helpers or advisors originally, way back when, and together. They all help us and write it all down and form a book or something of that nature.
So food for thought. If anybody's interested in getting involved, it sounds like Peter is thinking how important, and you always talk about your sunset years and how important it is to gather this, right?
Yeah, I'm interested in history, period. And there's such a wealth of information from me, and the younger generation has said, "Oh, the hell with you," sort of thing. You're an old guy. You don't know bugger all. Well, I'm sorry. I know all sorts of things, but they don't ask. They don't want to know the ins and outs and what's going to happen. They want to reinvent the wheel.
You've seen it all. You've seen it all. And it's... Anyway, it's, I think, very important to document all of this. How many of you are familiar with the Eve case? Yep, a number of people. So we'll do a quick little, because we're going to keep moving along. So a very brief description of this, but the way I always start off is, so this was 1981 that the case was settled. The footage in the media of when this celebratory day, when people labeled with intellectual disabilities for the first time had taken an issue all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada and had victory around sterilization rights. Peter was one of the main people who was involved with People First in making that happen.
Well, there was this lady in Prince Edward Island who was seen holding hands with this other gentleman from the workshop. Now, they were both labeled as having an intellectual disability, but they were talking of getting married. Well, Mom didn't like this. She took it to the court, lower court of Prince Edward Island. They said, no, Mom didn't like the decision, so she took it to the upper court in Prince Edward Island. And they said she should get a hysterectomy. The Canadian Association heard about this, and they said, okay, we can't do anything because we're professionals and parents, or won't do anything, I should say. And the Self-Advocate Committee, or Consumer Advisory Committee from across Canada, heard about this, said, if you guys will give us the money, we'll take it on. And we got the money and went to the Supreme Court with it. And yes, the verdict was that no person shall be sterilized. Sterilization doesn't just happen to women, by the way, it happens to men too, shall be sterilized without their consent. Now, this was not only a victory for people labeled intellectual disability, it applies to every person right across Canada. So it was a real major victory.
Incredible, and just such a day of celebration. So more stories. I mean, that's just one example of the rights work that Peter's been engaged in over the last 40 years. Another piece.
The thing is, I remember that celebration, as you called it. We went. That was when I had my first champagne.
And now Honey Nut Brown Ale is the champagne during the air last night.
Yeah.
But another thing, so I ran into Ben earlier, who works at Community Living Toronto. A lot of you are involved with these ACLs, community livings. And as you know, there's a history prior to becoming community living. These places were called Associations for Mentally Retarded. And do you want to talk a little bit about your involvement in the name change?
No, my involvement in anything. Well, I was disgusted with Ontario, actually.
Disgusted with the term?
I was disgusted with Ontario because
Ontario.
every other province changed their name to Association for something else. We didn't want. We were asking for a non-labeling name, and Ontario was the last province to change their name. It was an uphill battle. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It was 6 years before Ontario changed their name. Everybody else had changed their name. So let's start. Let's see what year it started.
So all across the country, people were realizing.
Yeah.
Community
started
living.
in 1985, and in 1991, Ontario finally changed her to Association for Community Living.
And Peter, again, was at the helm tirelessly, staying with us. Peter has just been such an inspiration to me. He always says, change is slow, change is slow. We have to just stay with these things.
It's not change is slow, good change.
Good change, even better. Exactly, good change. So there's a couple of just a tiny little notes. Again, we really want to document and get more of Peter's stories because he's been involved in so much advocacy over the years. I kind of like this one. You guys may relate to this. Here's a term Peter has.
Well, I have, over the years, I've gotten my degree. I'm a community advocate PhD, piled high and deeper. How I came up, when my older brother got his PhD, I remember saying to him in Convocation Hall, well, Bob, you're piled high and deeper. That's where it comes from.
Which I love. With your dad, as you said before, as a pharmacist, and your brother involved in a doctor, right? And
he is a doctor of chemistry.
so you've been very engaged and exposed to research. And the cool thing is, so you talked about being in the institution and being a guinea pig, so being involved in research, but not as an activist, not as a primary consenting person.
No.
And then you got out of the institution, and then you got involved in community research, which you realized was research. Nobody was calling it research. So many self-advocates were engaged in this, but they didn't realize what they were doing was really important research. So do you want to talk about this?
Okay. This was an international thing. People brought pieces of the quilt. What was the issue in their country? There were. It was an international conference. There were 91 different countries represented, and they brought. It might be transportation was the issue. Abuse might be the issue. All these quilt pieces showed somehow what the issue was in that particular geographic community. And it made me realize I was doing research maybe by a different name, but I was doing research. That was the first time I realized it. This was back in 93, 94, somewhere in there.
So powerful, and it's engaging people in an accessible way. So people are bringing their art, their stories, and bringing it all together.
Also, a lot of our members, they don't read. So it's a way that they can actually see something so that, hey, I'm part of that. And it's powerful.
Because we talk sometimes about how many self-advocates, how many people labeled with disability have even heard of research, even know what research is, even know that all the people like those of you in this room are working hard to make things better for people, but sometimes the dissemination or the storytelling, getting it back out there, knowledge translation, isn't really getting to the people who need to hear it, right?
Well, oftentimes, like myself, this is the first time I've been to OADD, and why, I don't know, but it's a great experience, and I wish that I'd done it before. So I think it's positive that other people are starting to maybe, to me, it's a way of working towards inclusion. I didn't say that we were including, I said working towards.
It's so incredibly important because I know with inclusion, Peter and I, years ago in 2011, wrote an article for the OADD talking about tokenism and self-advocacy, which we had a lot of fun working on that. And again, storytelling and saying, you know what, inclusion shouldn't be tokenistic. And we've always, Peter and I haven't done this yet, but we've talked about doing a presentation in which we bring a number of languages. So have a little video that's in multiple languages, ask everybody sit down with a pen and paper and take notes on the rights violations that they experience in the video. And
Who speaks Greek?
Who speaks Greek, right? Probably some people in the room. But and then asking people to comment back, and then people say, well, it wasn't in English, I didn't understand it. And then, as you were saying, that's what it's like for a lot of self-advocates when they're invited to board meetings, to meetings that are not accessible. We talk about the AODA, right? That people have the right to have access and around comprehension. That's why Peter keeps pushing the art stuff, eh?
Oh yeah, I'm quite inclusion means something that people can relate to in their life, not so it's not what a professional can relate to, it's what the average, I call it the average Joe on the street can relate to.
So Peter's co-published a number of articles. So like I said, Peter's worked with Marcia Rue and Marianne Burke and a number of places. He used to work for the Ontario government as a plain language translator.
That was my biggest mistake, working for the government.
Plain language translation, right? But so the OADD publication on this tokenism and challenges in self-advocacy, and then this last year we published together the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies, and I have one of the pieces from that. But you've co-published also not only your community work, but you've also been publishing.
Involved in publishing, yeah.
Peter always pushes me to say, Sue, it can't always be words. Even if we're doing plain language in the writing, you got to have pictures in there.
You got to have a lot of pictures.
Right? So for you and Martin, who is the other co-author with us on the Canadian Journal article around your stories of institutionalization, you said, let's have a photograph of us in the journal.
We got to have a photo of us, like Martin. He experienced institutional life, not as long as I did.
And I'm going to go right to another image that you can talk about. Peter talked earlier about his time in the institution when he was being researched without his consent. And when Peter said, no, I'm not taking that medication because it's not in the Merck manual, here's where you ended up. So do you want to talk a bit about this? And we created this image together, by the way. So Peter,
this is what I remembered D-Ward as being like 40 years later. I dictated, Sue did the drawing as I hold it up more. I dictate what I thought, what I could remember. And it was, okay, I was bare, the walls were bare, the hole in the floor. Why I'm in a fetal position is that you were in that fetal position to keep warm, no matter what. That was your only, well, that hole in the floor was where was your washroom when you were in there, so it wasn't that good. Then when they decided, they'd feed you.
when they decided to feed you, yeah.
If they decided
If
to.
they decided. And so in creating this together, so we wrote a little bit of a piece talking about trauma and consent and working together. So Peter and I meet a lot together. I love working with Peter because he's a big believer in eating food together. So we have a lot of meals. Often our meetings involve having a meal and talking and spending a lot of time. So that's another thing is it's those of us who are in a rush when we have a grant and we have a deadline and we have to get things done. We really need to make the time, right, to spend together when helping people tell their stories. So it took a lot of time, but it was so important to you to have an image. And that, so this was our data collection.
I
right?
think that image took about, we didn't get it done in, maybe it were about 4 different meetings before we finalized it.
Yeah. And I'm not an artist, by the way. I just worked along. So those of you who were artists may be ahead of the game on this. But it's simply, as you said, it doesn't matter. We just got to get it out there, right? So a little tiny bit, we'll speak. We've been referring to it: ethics, consent, and decision-making rights, sharing the journey, co-authorship, and we're going to get right to an image. Alan, do you want to stand up where you are? We didn't know Ellen was going to be here. So we have a video, so we're just going to get right to this. So hopefully everybody can hear this okay.
As a researcher who has been working with people labeled with an intellectual disability in different projects about sexuality, I have had to spend a significant amount of time educating ethics review boards on the importance of including people with intellectual disabilities in research. We know that, historically, labeled people have been given fewer opportunities to talk about their own perspectives and experiences in comparison with other social actors in their lives. Based on my own interactions with ethics review boards, as well as what I hear from other scholars in the field, we still have a long way to go. Just as an example, I was once told that people with intellectual disabilities would not give me, quote, any good data, end quote, and that instead I should focus on interviewing parents and support workers about their perspectives on the romantic and intimate lives of labeled people. I had to push back and educate the board about nothing about us, without us, and why that is extremely important. The protection, the ethical inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities in research are a serious matter, especially considering that we do have precedents of unethical research and how disabled people more broadly have a long history of experiencing exploitation, abuse, and being denied privacy. At the same time, I believe that it's also unethical to assume that labeled people cannot make their own decisions, and that although greater care is needed, people with intellectual disabilities have the right to share their perspectives and speak on their own behalf.
Thank you, Alan. So by the way, come and chat with him at lunch. He does super exciting work and is very engaged. Do you want to say a couple words about Alan's?
I was impressed when I heard the fact that, okay, this is about consent. And I said, oh, what's he going to talk about? And then Sue said that he was doing some research, but because the ethics committee said he couldn't talk to these, couldn't possibly talk to people with disabilities, but only could talk to their parents. That blew my mind. I said, people with disabilities can consent. There's nothing to it. Hey, I was so annoyed. It wasn't even funny. I sent an email. What question mark or
Yeah. And we're excited that Alan's here. And so a little tiny bit more now, we were going to have a clip of a lawyer talking about legal rights and decision-making rights and capacity when it comes to consenting to be involved in research. But we didn't have that. However, we will bring the lawyer to you. So just call us when you get the information there. This is what we do as we go around and do workshops. And again, we include that legal perspective and what are the person's legal rights to make their own decision and being involved. So when Peter and I have done papers together, especially for the peer-reviewed pieces, you know, I've worked with other researchers who say, okay, well, just get Peter to sign the consent forms. I said, well, hang on a minute. He's an author. He's one of the authors.
well, like when you say consent and research. I was in the hospital in October. All of a sudden, this person comes in the room and says, will you do this research? And I said, what? And what's it about? Would you do? What's it about? Would you do this research?
And they weren't able to give
They
you
didn't
plain
tell
language.
me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I said no.
Nope. Don't understand it, not doing it, right? And so like the typical consent forms that we have, right, that lawyers have gone over and for our organizations or in our institutions or hospitals, wherever we're working, right, the lawyers and the management will say, well, you've got to use this because this is what the lawyers okayed. So a big form like this, where our big belief is no. We want it to be plain language. So with Arch, we've created something that's pictorial, right? So using images. And consent should not be obtained under pressure. It should be a process of meeting with people. And as Peter said,
And consent needs to be what that person needs at that time, not something that's rushed. And oftentimes, oh, you got to sign this or else, sort of thing. No, it's got to be made individualized. Some people, like myself, before I can say yes, I have to think about it. And I oftentimes don't, it takes me overnight to come to a conclusion.
yeah, I love it. Oftentimes, Peter and I will be discussing a decision around something that we're doing together, and he says, let me get back to you. And then the next day, he'll have a very clear answer, very informed decision, but you need that time. And so that's what
I
we'll say.
need that time.
Yeah.
Give me 24 hours sort of thing, and I'll give you an answer. But right then, no.
Not rushing it, right? So dissemination, getting our stories out. We're leading up to, as Peter was saying, I was giving things away almost earlier, but we're leading up to asking for you to talk to us about how you can be involved in inclusive research.
What I call, we aren't just doing the work up here. It's up, you guys we're gonna put you to work too.
So we do want to talk about, so dissemination, that's another piece is how often, this is what Peter started off when I said, okay, we're going to be doing a talk around research. He said, well, how often does the research reach the people, right? How often does it get to the people who matter, the people's lives affected?
And what does how does it affect their daily life? Not just their lives, but their daily life. How is it going to affect me today? What's going to happen to the research? Is it going to find dust on some shelf? Is it, or is it, who's going to see the research?
And getting the things out there. Ann Fudge-Normans was the keynote speaker a couple of years. Was it last year or 2 years ago? Yeah, 2 years ago. And talks about her dissemination practices involve going out and doing role plays, right? Going out and actually experiencing role plays, bringing it to people with disabilities, giving them an opportunity to learn about it and role play it. So we'll get to that. I'm going to show one more image. Peter suggested having an image like this. Do you want to talk a little bit about this picture?
Definitely. The first one is what I call the horrible one.
So the top left.
Now, it's starting to get a little better, but not very much. On the next one, the segregation. Now, that brings us down to, okay, we talk about integration. Well, okay, it's still not very good. Finally, we get to inclusion, where everybody is included. The circles, as you notice, have gone from a small thing to a large. I think that fourth one is what the culture of the if I can say it right,
Cultural inclusion.
Indigenous peoples should have taught us.
Yeah.
Because that's what they're doing, is including everybody, whether the person has a disability or not.
And Peter and Vicki last night when we were having dinner were talking about, if you think about research, think about women's research historically, and women aren't allowing men to tell their stories for them anymore. Women are involved, right? And Indigenous research. Indigenous people are telling their stories, right? Rather than the external people researching and bringing the statistics out, and they were saying the same thing. This is the next area where we need to push, right, around disability, intellectual disability, having people involved.
Well, and it was pointed out last night that how backwards Canada is. That for quite a few years, the UK has been involving research with intellectual disability.
Well, thank you so much for participating in that. Again, Peter said we got to get people role-playing, right? Experiencing it.
I think role-playing, it's a way of showing, including everybody, not just being this thing that includes only one person. But everyone, no matter what, they can experience a wonderful thing, being part of something.
It's amazing. So we talked earlier about the next steps, just how great it would be to really spend some time and gather all these incredible stories and this rich history of your work and the People First movement in general. So I think everybody in the room is aware we really want to do that, want to work with people on that. And then you want to speak about this and close with your...
Well, this is very important. Okay, you've got to be a visionary to actually do something positive. Or at least that's my opinion. And there aren't enough visionary people left around to actually do something, but get out there and do research in a different way. Be visionary in the way you do research. Don't just say, well, because the book says, I gotta do, forget the book. Just do what you feel is right. and actually get real, inclusive research. That's what I mean by visionary research. Dare to dream. Think outside that box. So we got that box out there. We always look at, oh, well, it's got to be here. No, wrong.